This video is intended for entertainment and historical purposes only. It's not meant to be an instructional tutorial or provide professional advice. What you see here is my new steam locomotive on its way to be unloaded from one trailer and loaded onto another for the trip home. Now, don't call me crazy just yet, as this actually makes a lot of sense. Having this new engine is integral to the overall plan and will really help the first engine's restoration. The goal of this project isn't just to restore these two locomotives back to operating condition. It's also about replicating something currently lost to history. Like I told you in the first video, Dinkies were generally operated in pairs, so really, I had to get another one. The sight of a steam shovel filling a string of gravel cars coupled to a little Dinky locomotive hasn't been seen in years. But the sight of a steam shovel working with a matched pair of 2-foot gauge Dinkies hasn't been seen in nearly a century, at least not in North America. I aim to change that. I'm sure you're wondering where I plan to do this, and how I'm going to get my hands on a steam shovel and 16 gravel cars to do it with. There's a plan in place for all that, but first we need to get the locomotives restored. So for the time being, let's talk about the new engine, and then a little later in the episode we'll compare both locomotives and review their individual restoration plans. The new engine was built by the Davenport Locomotive Works in 1906 for the construction firm Sims and Shields. Like the first locomotive, it's an 040 tank engine with 24-inch diameter drive wheels and 7 by 12-inch bore and stroke cylinders. In operating condition, it weighs in at 9 tons and has a whopping 3,540 pounds of tractive effort. According to Davenport, it was designed to haul up to 158 tons on a 0.5% grade and maxed out at 21 tons on a 5% grade. From the research I've done, these two engines are the only 2-foot gauge Davenport Dinkies in existence that retain their original short saddle tanks. This gives them that very unique look that was so common to the contractor's Dinky, but quite rare today. Now here's why having this second locomotive makes so much sense. Every single piece missing from the first engine is still on this one. So now we have something to copy from to accurately reproduce the parts. These are things like the sand dome, smokestack, steam dome cover, and Johnson bar, among other things. Here's the best part. Everything the new engine's missing, we're already planning to fabricate for the first engine. So other than a little added material cost, this is going to be a 2-for-1 restoration project. I guess by now you're wondering why the engine was moved from one trailer to another and now onto a crane truck. Short story is, some friends picked it up for me and we had to swap trailers for the trip home. And where I've got my storage track is a little too tight for the trailer and the crane, so it was just easier to load it onto the crane truck and keep the trailer out of the way. The storage track is going to act like a RIP track, or repair in place track, for the restorations. Rather than take up valuable real estate in the machine shop, components can be prepped or stored here until their turn in the shop. Additionally, it's a very convenient place to access the engines with either the backhoe or a crane truck. One end of the track uses 100-pound rail with a tie-free section about 7 feet long. This will allow me to fit under the engines to drop the binders and brake rigging when the time comes. It's basically a redneck maintenance pit, but that's all I need for now. As exciting as it is to have the new locomotive home, the priority is still to get the first engine torn apart and moved into the shop so the restoration can get going. Once that happens, we'll turn our attention to the second locomotive. So for the time being, it's just going to be in storage at the very back of the track. With the new engine safely unloaded, we turned our attention to the first locomotive, using the crane to place it over the pit in preparation for the next stage of disassembly. Let's start with locomotive number 1. Now this isn't its actual number, but just what I'm going to refer to it as for the time being. The next thing we're going to do to the engine is pull the frame assembly off the drive wheels and get that into the machine shop. It's hard to say right now, but I expect it'll be in the shop for at least a year, if not 2. As you know, the engine has some significant issues, but the cylinder saddle damage is by far the most concerning. One story claims the miners used dynamite to separate the saddle from the boiler. Another story says they used sledgehammers. Either way, the ears of the saddle were broken off and never found. Something that adds credibility to the dynamite story is the large chunk missing from the back of the saddle. Fortunately, this is just cosmetic and there's no damage to the steam or exhaust passages. All of this will be repaired in such a way that the casting will be as structurally sound as it was when brand new. Aesthetically, we're considering a 1920s style blacksmith repair look as kind of a way of recognizing the engine's unique history. The left crosshead guide bar, piston rod, and valve stem are all bent. These will be replaced with new parts, but we're hoping to repair the crosshead itself. This is all damage sustained when the engine was pushed off the tracks and into the ditch up at the mine. This gear was added when the locomotive was converted to internal combustion. It will be getting removed and tossed in the scrap bin. The spring rigging is in pretty bad condition and will require new spring saddles and spring hanger pins. Right now, I think the hangers and equalizer are okay, but the springs themselves are a total unknown. It's likely that we'll replace all the springs just so we never have to worry about them. We'd keep the original springs as emergency spares for engine number 2, just in case. The back axle drives the Stephenson link valve gear through the use of 4 cast eccentrics. This allows the locomotive to move forward and reverse. Unfortunately, those 4 eccentrics were crudely removed with sledgehammers up at the mine. This is going to necessitate casting new eccentrics. However, I'm going to deviate from the original pattern and use 2-piece eccentrics to avoid pressing the drive wheels off the axle. Another piece of the spring rigging that requires replacement is this broken stud filling the role as a spring gib. Another question mark is the left side rod. It has a pretty nasty bend to it, but we might be able to avoid replacing it by straightening it out, stress relieving it, and then machining new bearings. Doing this would allow us to match the left and right side rods, so they're completely identical and no alignment issues could occur. This engine came with one original main connecting rod, which is currently serving as the pattern for the 3 new ones needed for both engines. I'll cover this further in future episodes. The right side of the engine doesn't have any mine-related damage, but we'll still be getting a new piston rod and crosshead guide bar. This is due to how corroded they both are. And that's the 10-cent tour of engine number 1. Okay, let's talk about locomotive number 1's restoration plan. The next thing we're going to do is pull the frame and cylinders off the wheels and get that chunk into the shop so we can start addressing the damage to the cylinder saddle. That's going to be priority number 1. Priority number 2 is getting new parts cast and fabricated so they're ready to be machined and fitted when the time comes. The cylinders and frame are the foundation of the whole locomotive, so this assembly will be completed first, followed by the spring rigging, wheels, and valve gear. We're going to cast 4 new split eccentrics, 1 eccentric strap, 2 furnace bearers, both smokebox steam pipes, a left and a right-hand rocker box, a new smokestack, and a sand dome. I'll be making wooden patterns for all these parts using engine number 2 as a template. Then, when all this is done and the running gear has been tested on air in the shop, we'll start on the spare boiler. It'll get serviced, fitted with new steam pipes, throttle rod, and packing gland, and then get fitted to the running gear. At this point, all that's left to do is build a new wooden cab and saddle tank, then paint it. I've made this sound significantly easier than it's actually going to be. Now keep in mind, this is a very basic overview of the plan, and it's subject to change as time goes on. Alright, let's take a closer look at locomotive number 2. Again, That's not its actual number, but it's just what I'm going to refer to it as for the time being. This engine has an early style embossed Davenport Locomotive Works smokebox door and a cast door ring, which needs some attention. As you can see, the smokebox needs to be totally cleaned out and thoroughly inspected, but at first glance, looks pretty good. What I'm really happy about is the condition of the front tube sheet and tube sheet rivets. Visually, there's no wear or corrosion, which is commonly associated with this part of the boiler. Comparing engine number 1 and engine number 2 is like comparing a 1967 Mustang with a 1968 Mustang. They're basically the same, just with some very minor changes that most people wouldn't really notice. One of the most noticeable differences is right here on the side of the cylinder casting. Davenport is cast into the side of the steam chest. This is something missing from engine number 1's cylinder casting. Oddly enough, the drive wheels are also very different between the two engines, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. This engine requires a new set of brass crosshead slippers, because the old ones disappeared at some point, and 12 new crosshead bolts that are of the appropriate style for 1906. As I mentioned before, it needs two new main connecting rods, which connect the crosshead to the main connecting pin and transfer the steam power from the cylinders to the wheels. Other than these parts, the running gear is essentially complete and in very nice condition. Unlike engine number 1's running gear, which requires a major overhaul, engine number 2 just needs a thorough cleaning and servicing. The saddle tank appears to be very solid and just needs sandblasting, painting, new running boards, and brackets to be serviceable. It'll be getting removed soon so we can sandblast the boiler and start the non-destructive boiler inspection process. This includes a hydrostatic test and an ultrasound. Overall, the engine looks really good. These quadrants, this being the brake, and this being forward and reverse, will be coming off, along with the handles and the reach rods. All of this will go into the machine shop and get copied for engine number 1. In the process, new brass latches and trigger assemblies currently missing from number 2 will be fabricated and fitted. Another difference between the two engines is definitely the boiler. This being an earlier engine, it has an externally flanged firebox door ring and sheet, meaning the inner firebox door sheet is riveted to a ring that is externally riveted to the outside door sheet flange. Neither engine number 1 nor the spare boiler is built like this. As you can see, the inner firebox looks really good. I haven't found any signs of damage, corrosion, or even repairs. I don't know much about this engine's history, but I suspect it didn't get much use. I'm very optimistic that once we start doing the boiler inspection and testing, it's going to confirm that this boiler is really as good as it looks. If we have a look inside this washout plug hole, you can see the crown sheet and stay bolts look brand new, not a hint of wear. This is another very pleasant surprise. We're going to replace this furnace bearer. As you can see, it's broken right here. This casting is what secures the firebox to the frame while still allowing the firebox to move back and forth as it expands and contracts. Engine number 1 is missing a furnace bearer, so this is something I was already planning to make. Now I think I'll cast a total of 4, so I can replace this one and still have a spare. Again, same thing as the right-hand side. We're missing the crosshead slippers, connecting rod, and that's about it for missing running gear parts. Let's squeeze in here and have a look at the number 2 axle. This gives you an idea how it should look with the eccentrics and eccentric straps in place versus what engine number 1 currently looks like. You can see this cross member, which supports the crosshead guides, it's missing from engine number 1. So we'll use this one as a pattern and get a new one water cut. These are the Stephenson links, which are operated by the eccentrics on the number 2 axle. They look pretty good, but definitely need to be taken apart, inspected, and cleaned up, just like everything on this engine. One of the really surprising things about this engine is the condition of the valves and valve chests, especially considering somebody removed all the valve chest nuts at some point in time. I'm really happy how nice this looks. There doesn't seem to be any scoring on the valve face, and the valve itself still has a film of oil on it. Thankfully, the other side looks just as nice. Since there's only one nut holding the cylinder head on, let's pull it off and see how it looks in there. Due to the piston being fully forward, there's not a lot to see. But what I can see looks pretty good, mostly because of how oily it is. Let's go have a look at the other side now. This cylinder head looks homemade. It might need to get replaced. Looks like wasps were living in here. But overall, it looks pretty good. Nice and oily. All right, let's discuss locomotive number 2's restoration plan. Once engine number 1 has been mostly moved into the shop, I want to get number 2 over the raised track. I don't want to roll it until I'm sure nothing will get damaged. So that means the valve gear and brake rigging needs to be disconnected, and the axle journals need to be lubricated. Once it's over the pit, we'll drop the pedestal binders and we'll lift it off its wheels. It'll then get stripped down to a bare boiler and frame, at which point it'll be sandblasted. The boiler will then be inspected, and everything will be repaired and refurbished as needed. As I mentioned before, we'll be casting a couple new furnace bearers, but those will be part of the batch done for engine number 1. The boiler is missing most of its washout plugs, but I'm hoping to reuse the originals from number 1's boiler. If they turn out to be no good, well, then we'll get a few cast. The engine is missing its original steam manifold, or fountain, as Davenport called it, so we'll use the one on the spare boiler as a template to make a pattern and core box. Once all this is done, reassembly will start, hopefully in conjunction with engine number 1. Again, this all sounds so much easier than it's actually going to be. Because of its condition, engine number 2 will receive a significantly less comprehensive restoration in comparison to engine number 1. Again, this is all subject to change, but this is the basic plan as it sits right now. As I mentioned earlier, this engine has the early style embossed smokebox door that has Davenport Locomotive Works cast right into it. The other boilers have just a plain door that should have a cast Davenport Locomotive Works spot number plate bolted to the front. If we look in here, you can see just how rough this boiler actually is, especially after comparing it with engine number 2. When you really start looking at this boiler in detail, it's an absolute wonder that Jim was willing to go to all that trouble to save it and ship it home from Alaska in the first place. Just look at the pitting and corrosion on the top of the wrapper sheet. Or if you look at the decent rivets versus just how rotten and wasted the really bad ones are. This thing is just trashed. Same thing if you look at the support brace rivets. Then there's the various dents and dings on the back end. It's a little dark, but you can see the firebox and firebox door differences that I mentioned earlier. It's unfortunate, but I think this boiler is only going to be contributing the washout plugs, if they're serviceable, the throttle packing gland, and maybe a few other odds and sods, but that's about it. Remember earlier when I told you the drive wheels were different on each engine? This is one of those funny things that I only recently noticed, but now it stands out like a sore thumb to me. Look at the drive wheels on engine number 2. It has very small, almost non-existent counterweights. Now, compare that to the counterweights on number 1's wheels, which are large and conventional in appearance. Leave me a comment if you have any theories about why Davenport did this. Thanks for watching.